Good morning, YouTube. I've had a lot of folks ask about our monitor rig, our in-ear monitor rig, who we affectionately call Bertha. And so I was going to give a little brief rundown of what we use and how it's wired so that folks can get some ideas for doing their own rig. The brains of the operation here is the MOTU 828 Mark III, which is a recording interface, but it works really well as more or less a digital mixer. So that is the brain of the entire rig. When we get around to the back of the unit, I'll show you why it works so well. The preamps that we chose to use for this rig are the Behringer, I think it's called the 80A 8000. It's also known as the Ultra Gain Pro 8 Digital. There's a couple reasons we chose this unit. I mean, price is obviously one. They're very cheap. I think they retail for maybe a couple $100 a piece. And you know, a lot of folks will scoff that it's Behringer, but they're actually decent pre's, especially for the price. It's not going to front of house. It's just for your in-ears, and given some of the other features that they hold, which we'll discuss on the back of the unit as well, they're a really good value. And if one goes out, which we've actually never had happen in 4 years, which is, I guess, kind of a miracle, then they're relatively easy to find as well. Most guitar centers and those kind of stores carry them. One key to the success of having an in-ear rig is having a splitter, so that you can feed both your preamps or your mixer and the front of house mixer. So what we've done is chosen the ART S8. We have 24 channels. They're 8 channels each. And these splitters basically give one direct output and one transformer isolated output. The direct output feeds our Behringer preamps, which in turn feeds the MOTU, and the transformer isolated output goes to front of house. They also have input pads and ground lifts on each one, which is sometimes handy. We power everything in the rack with this UPS, which is an uninterruptible power supply. This particular one is by Minuteman, and I think we got it at upsforless.com, which is refurbished. It's always been like this, unfortunately. It's got a bad cell, but it's got, like, I think 8 cells, so it beeps every so often. I think that's probably why, but it has never let us down. We've had power outages. It gives you sine wave, straight up sine power, so it's better than a Furman or that kind of thing. And highly recommended. We've actually run the entire stage off this before when we've encountered joints that have bad power. So in the bottom of our rack we have 2 snakes coiled up with their snake heads, and the reason being is that basically one goes to front of stage, one goes to back of stage to avoid spaghetti. And these are hardwired. They stay wired to the splitter inputs, which keeps the cables alive. The snakes and the rack that we use are both OSP, which is a budget audio company. It's not the highest quality stuff, but it gets the job done for pretty cheap. And as long as you're good to your gear, it lasts. The rack has been great. The caster brakes broke a year or so ago after a lot of use, but the rack itself is a shock mount rack, and it's been great. So those are the basic components, and this is basically how it's wired. You start with the snake, and obviously your mics get put in your snake. I would highly suggest using your own mic so that your inputs are the same for every show. You end up saving these settings, but if you're using different microphones, those will obviously change. At any rate, it gets plugged into the snake. The snake is lives in the bottom of the rack, and is wired and stays wired to the splits. So these blue and black cables are coming from the 2 snakes directly to the inputs. On the inside of the rack, you can see that each channel on the split has a direct output and a transformer isolated microphone output. These also stay wired in the rack. One goes to our preamps. So here's the input to the preamp, and I've left half a rack space to thread these through from the front back to the front. And that's the direct output that goes to our preamps that feed our in-ears. The transformer ISO'd output actually goes to a snake, which is basically just an XLR extension snake. And this goes to front of house. So this is what you would feed to the front of house snake head or junction box. We've labeled them all with actual input labels to make it easy for front of house. Okay, so now you really have to think about your signal flow. So far you have your microphones feeding your two snakes. The two snakes are feeding the 3 splitters. I mean, it's just 24 channels. It just happens to be broken up that way. And the splitter outputs, the transformer ISO'd outputs, are on these extension XLR snakes, and they're feeding front of house. So front of house should be happy at this point. They should be getting a strong signal from every mic. The direct outputs are feeding the Behringers, and now we have to get the output from the Behringer into the MOTU. We have to go through a couple different steps to do this because of the limitations of both units. Okay, so we're at on the MOTU now. This is the back of the MOTU. You've got 8 analog inputs back here that we'll be concerning ourselves with. That's what all these multicolored cables are plugged into, the inputs. You also have 2 banks of light pipe. It's very dark back here. Let's see if the iPhone won't adjust, but if you can sort of see that. Okay, there we go. You have 2 banks of optical or ADAT input, optical A and optical B. It's one in and one out per bank. We're using all of these inputs. That's what we're using to feed our 24 channels. So it's done in a couple different ways because those are the limitations of the MOTU. You have to feed 8 on analog and 16 on digital in order to get up to 24. So in order to make that work, in order to use all 24 channels we have available to us in the MOTU, and actually there's a few more channels than that, but the ones that we're using, you have to treat one of the Behringer preamps a little differently than the other 2. So it's a good time to explain the reason we chose these Behringers, aside from the price and availability, is actually that the outputs, the XLR outputs, these guys, are not fed directly from the mic pre. They are fed from the ADAT input on the Behringer unit itself, which is here, right there. So, and that's a great thing in terms of routing and having a flexibility to actually feed our mixes, which we're going to do here in a moment. But the first unit has to be treated differently because we need to get the output from this Behringer into the analog inputs. That's what these multicolored cables are, right? In order to do that, all we have to do is take one ADAT cable or optical cable and just plug it from the output right back into the input. So basically it sends the output from the pre's right back into the input, and it's another step of conversion, but you know, we're not trying to win any awards here. It works really well. It basically what it basically does is it just makes these direct outputs from the preamps, line level outputs, and in turn those line level outputs feed the line level inputs on the MOTU. So you've got your first 8 channels taken care of. The first 8 channels, the way that I have it routed anyway internally in the MOTU software, is that the first 8 channels are the analog inputs on the MOTU, and they're fed from this first Behringer.